Let me go to Mark Faber in Budapest. Mark, I heard you say that you now believe it is 100% guaranteed that we are going to have hyperinflation like Zimbabwe.
Yes, that's correct.
And if we destroy our currency, which is what the Obama plan might do, if we have hyperinflation, it's not going to matter how much money we have because we're not going to be able to buy anything with it.
Well, Adrian, when you print gigantic amounts of money and you flood the world with money throughout history, that has led to inflation.
If you're worried about $4 a gallon of gasoline, you better worry about an $8 a gallon of gasoline.
The problem is we have a printing press. We can pay our debts by printing money. People think that hyperinflation can't happen here. Well, you know, the laws of physics works everywhere. If you throw a ball up in the air in Zimbabwe, gravity is going to bring it back down.
You can't print phantom money out of thin air based on nothing and producing practically nothing without causing the dollar to devalue dramatically.
That's not deflation, that's temporary.
Quantitative easing is inflation. But they're going to blow us all up.
So my question to you is, will you tell the American people to whom you lent $2.2 trillion of their dollars? Will you tell us who got that money and what the terms are of those agreements?
No.
Inflation, simply explained, is the printing of money. Inflation is the value of the money in your pocket going down, while prices all around you rise. When gas prices rise, when your grocery bills go up, this is a symptom of inflation. The Federal Reserve is printing money out of thin air every day. If you have money in the bank, that money is decreasing in value. In other words, we should all be worried about inflation because it affects the prices of everything you use on a daily basis. There have been good men warning us for years about inflation. Jim Rogers, Peter Schiff, Mark Faber, Ron Paul, and many others. They have spoken about the uncontrollable spending that will lead to the total collapse of the United States. And then there have been those in power who have ignored the warnings. George W. Bush, Ben Bernanke, Timothy Geithner, Barack Obama, Nancy Pelosi, and all of Congress. We will show you how these individuals, through stimulus plans, bailouts, low interest rates, and the ever-expanding balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, will lead to the destruction of the U.S. currency.
We owe the world probably as much, if not more, than Germany owed, only we didn't incur this debt fighting a war. We incurred it remodeling our houses and buying cars and television sets and iPods and all these little gadgets that we didn't need, and now we owe the world trillions, and we're reaching for the printing press to pay it back.
Never before in world history were people able to buy houses with no money down. Many people bought 4 or 5 houses with no money down and no job. And then they did it with cars and student loans and credit card loans. You think we just say, well, that's too bad, we're going to start over, nobody loses his job? Be realistic.
This system that we've had since 1971 is non-viable, and it's coming to an end. That's what this whole story is about.
Our first presenter is Bob Hale. Bob lives with his lovely wife in Minot, North Dakota. I'm sorry, his wife's name is Susie. I mentioned they lived in Minot, but they live in Minot. His wife's name is Susie. They're parents of 4 children and proud grandparents of 4. Bob has degrees in business and law with minor studies in sociology. He is the founder and owner of a public interest law firm. Bob is an attorney and entrepreneur. He is a freelance columnist whose writings have been carried in local papers as well as national and international publications. As a businessman, Bob has invested in his community, building and managing premier retirement facilities. He has also invested time, money, and energy into improving the state of our state. He has spearheaded and supported several initiatives and referrals designed to rein in government. Many have complained about corporate welfare, commonly known as economic development, but Bob Hale has done something about it. He recently filed a lawsuit that challenges economic development, citing Article 9, Section 18 of the state constitution, which prohibits the state and all local government from giving loans, credit, donations, or aid of any private company at all. This is a daring lawsuit, which we hope will be a rallying point for us all who want limited government. Like our founders, he has staked his fortune and reputation and his principles on the line for liberty. Hale has a clear vision of the direction of our state, at the direction the state is taking, as well as the potential we have to make this a great state. If we get nothing else from this today, I hope we will take Bob's vision of this state. We have a great state. And if we take this vision and take the power to make it a better state with a glimpse of Bob's vision for North Dakota, each one of us can take a look at our government and how it can be more responsive to make it a great state. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Bob Hale.
Thank you for the introduction, Jason. I'm sure pleased to be here this afternoon to speak to you. I'm talking on property taxes. What I'm specifically talking on is how we constitutionally abolish property taxes in North Dakota. Now, I'm going to be showing a lot of slides that have a lot of numbers. Don't worry about trying to read them. Actually, I don't think you'll be able to. I do have a booklet that has all of this information in it, so those who want to peruse it later, pick that up. Please try to listen to what I'm saying and see where we're trying to go and where I'd like to see this state go. Democracy isn't a spectator sport. We either participate or we need to be prepared to live with the consequences of those who do participate. Today, our governmental institutions have done more to strip away our liberty than all other threats, currently or historically, combined. And it has done so by invading our privacy and taxing us to death. Changing the current situation requires more than electing different people. We need to reestablish and enforce the constitutional nature of our government. Democracy is, in general, a wonderful thing. However, we are not simply a democracy, we're a constitutional democracy, yet our government routinely ignores the Constitution. The purpose of a constitutional democracy is to ensure we put in place to thwart the ambitions, the avarice, the greed, the mischief, which is the nature of men and women, and have the Constitution ensure we become a nation again of laws, not of men or mobs. I believe we need to significantly restructure government at every level. The type of governmental restructuring necessary is simple in concept, but will be challenging. However, it can be done, and you here can do it. There's only one way to effectively control government. We must limit the amount of revenue it is able to take from us. There are no limits right now on the amount of the earnings we have the government can take. None. If they wanted to take it all, they could. There's no limitation. It's time we let our elected representatives know we elect them not to decide how much of what we earn we get to keep, but instead we elect them to prioritize spending the precious dollars we choose to give them. You've heard that other countries have higher taxes than we have. That's not true. We currently have an $11 trillion debt and a projected $9 trillion more over the next 10 years. Factoring our debt in, we have the highest federal taxes in the world, and that doesn't include our state or local taxes. To change government as we've known it, we must begin a new American revolution. We must constitutionally impose strict, meaningful, and unchangeable controls on the amount of our earnings any governmental entity is permitted to take, and we must enforce these controls. That currently is not being done. To effectively do so, we must impose constitutional limits, putting meaningful controls in the hands of those who pay taxes. That's us. Not in the hands of those who spend them, the legislatures and the special interests, as well as limit the sources they can tap to impose taxes. It is my hope that our state will become the model for this vital and necessary change. I have no illusions about directly challenging or changing the federal government. It has grown too big, too irresponsible, too controlling, and fails to respond to those whom it chooses to rule. It operates as if it has no limitations, despite the fact that our federal Constitution places significant limits on it. Remember, the United States was originally founded on the theory of limited government. That's no longer true. So where do we start? I believe we start by constitutionally abolishing property taxes in our state. We start right here in North Dakota. We start right here in this theater today. We begin by changing how our government operates. We take control of the taxes we pay. Our state's founding fathers provided us the tools we need. In North Dakota, the people, you, me, us, have the power to change the Constitution. We need to do so now. We need to begin this revolution, I believe, by abolishing property taxes. I've been told it can't be done. Let's not forget that's what the British Parliament told the Continental Congress. It can be done, and it can be done in short order, and you here can make it happen. We've been told we need that three-legged stool of taxation. We need income taxes. We need sales taxes, and we need property taxes. That's nonsense. These states have no personal income tax. They seem to get along. These states have no corporate income tax. They seem to get along. These states have no sales tax. They seem to get along. There is, unfortunately, no state that doesn't have a property tax. Let's make North Dakota the first. Let's do it over the next 2 years. Doing so will be a major step in regaining our liberty and controlling our government. Liberty, true liberty, requires 5 things. 1, privacy in one's life and possessions. 2, taking and being held responsible for what we do and what we don't do, individually, personally. 3, security in and of our home. 4, freedom to do as we choose. 5, effective control of what you give government or of what government takes from you. Property taxes directly and obnoxiously violate both the first and third of these requirements for true liberty. Skeptics ask, can we afford it? That's a silly question. Who's we? You, me, our neighbors? Or is it the bureaucrats and the elected officials who like this form of taxation because it's easy? I believe the proper question is, can we afford not to? This was in a recent article in the Minot Daily News. Minot City Finance Director was quoted saying, property tax collections will increase. Let's remember, folks, that household income dropped more in the last year than any time since 1947. It dropped by 3.6%. 1947 was a long time ago. I wasn't even born then. While the average taxpayer in Minot has had no increase in income and their house provides no better shelter, the city simply increases their taxes because it's easy. This is how people are taxed out of their homes. Proponents of the status quo tell us if we don't like it, we can elect different representatives. Does anyone here believe that's a viable solution? I think we all know it's a fiction. Since 1967, state general fund spending has increased 46% more than personal income. State general fund spending has increased 66% more than personal income. The state is continuing to take a larger and larger share of our income every single year. The last two biennium, we've had no income tax and no sales tax increases, nor has our population increased. Yet the state general fund spending increased 63%. That's a per capita increase of $1,962, or $7,850 on a family of four. How can this be? It's because both our sales and our income tax rates are far too high to begin with. This is how come the state has had these, quote, budget surpluses. They take too much. Let's also remember the minuscule property and income tax rebates that our representatives are giving us are simply an effort to mollify us and keep us from saying we've had enough. Unfortunately, the majority of these excess revenues are absorbed solely by special interests. While this has been happening, dozens and dozens of cities and county governments have been adding local option sales taxes. More money is coming out of our pockets. The first local option sales tax occurred, you can't read it, but it was 1986. Since then, we have 141 local jurisdictions now imposing that local option sales tax for more money. Further, our county revenues are growing at an unprecedented rate. On average, North Dakota's counties have cash and investment reserves totaling 78% of their annual budgets. Yet they continue to increase your taxes and continue to add to their investment portfolio. McLean County, for example, has revenues totaling 6 times its annual budget, yet it continues to tax and increase taxes. Why? 13 counties have cash reserves exceeding their annual budgets, yet they continue to increase their taxes. Now, let's take a look at abolishing property taxes. Between 1997 and 2005 was the last year I was able to get accurate tax information. Property taxes increased 46%, while the CPI increased less than 35%. In other words, they increased 1/3 faster than the CPI. Government is simply getting richer as we are getting poorer. Property taxes in North Dakota generate approximately $733 million annually. Abolishing property taxes may require replacing some of the income from other sources, or maybe we should simply reduce the size and growth of government. It's time for a new American revolution. It's time we put the government on a diet. It's time we revolutionarily change how government takes and spends our money. And abolishing property taxes, I believe, is the first and a necessary step. Between the 2005-07 and 2007-09 state biennium, the state increased general fund spending more than $1.25 billion. Not because of a need, but because they already had your money and it was burning a hole in their pockets. Taxes, again, are simply too high. We need to redirect taxes and pay only for necessary government functions and take it away from the special interests. Excess sales and income tax collections are sufficient in and of themselves if we wanted to replace the funding from property taxes to fund more than half of the property taxes. Local option sales tax could fund much, if not all of the balance, provided we believe all current spending is necessary. Again, I suggest we put government on a diet, or we can continue to let government tell us how much of what we're earning we get to keep. For those who believe there is no fat in government, remember, you're subsidizing college education for 17,000 non-resident students to the tune of almost $200 million every biennium. Why? No other state in the nation subsidizes non-resident college students. In fact, many, if not most, charge a premium. This is simple, blatant, special interest spending. But this is how we do it. We initiate a constitutional measure and place it on the ballot. We attempted to get the legislature to place this on the ballot in the last session. Unfortunately, only 6 legislators voted to do so. The rest felt you should have absolutely no opportunity to debate the merits of this or to vote on it. North Dakota can and should abolish property taxes. We would be the only state without them. If you want real market-driven economic development, abolishing property taxes would put North Dakota on the map. It would instantly make our state one of the most attractive in the nation to locate a business. But more important, it will guarantee each and every North Dakota resident security and privacy in their own home. Finally, there would be one state in this country where you can actually own your home and won't have to rent it from your government or lose it. Now, the Small Business Entrepreneurial Council annually puts out a rating of states relative to their business-friendly environment. The 2008 report shows North Dakota rated 22nd overall and business-friendly. I'm sure you're thinking, gee, we're in the top half. Well, South Dakota's number 1. Wyoming's number 3. Colorado's number 10. However, a critical look at the survey tells a dramatic story. It helps explain why North Dakota has had no meaningful economic or population growth over the last 50 years. Let's take a look at what's happening with the states around us. Since 1960, North Dakota's growth has been 1.4%. South Dakota, 18%. Montana, 43%. Wyoming, 61%. Minnesota, 52%. In my opinion, this is caused by the unfriendly attitude of government toward business and the protectionism that seeps from every corner of this state. Things like extraterritorial zoning, special tax provisions for co-ops, protectionist measures prohibiting non-North Dakota businesses from offering products and services, a monopoly workers' compensation system, irrational professional licensing measures are just a few of the hurdles that keep economic growth out of our state. I won't take time to analyze this chart. It's in the booklet. But suffice it to say, North Dakota's government and its policies are North Dakota's own worst enemy when it comes to growth and economic development. If we want change, we must make it happen. Our elected officials will not. The Small Business Index said this about property taxes, quote, "Property taxes influence decisions as to where businesses, entrepreneurs, and employees choose to locate, as well as decisions relating to investments in business facilities and homes. Abolishing property taxes in North Dakota is the surest way to put North Dakota on the economic development map. and help overcome some of the protectionist laws that currently keep industry out. Nothing would serve as a more powerful draw to business and industry than abolishing these horrific taxes. More importantly, it would secure your privacy in your home. Remember, isn't our home supposed to be our castle? You would no longer have to rent your home from your government. Once paid for, it would totally be yours. North Dakota is blessed with an abundance of natural resources, power, electricity, low utility rates, natural gas, oil, and water, as well as being the most centrally located state on the North American continent. Let's take off the shackles and move forward. Let's abolish property taxes in North Dakota. We should. There is nothing stopping us but our failure to simply do it. Ayn Rand, an author, said this: throughout the centuries, there were men who took first steps down new roads with nothing but their own vision. Let us be the ones taking first steps. Let's do what others are afraid to do. Let's begin our new American Revolution. We can do it, and we can start here today. After we abolish property taxes, we'll take the next step. Let's reclaim our government and see that it becomes a servant to us rather than we simply being its source of revenue.
Chris Olson, part owner of Treasure Island Coins, a family-run precious metal dealer for the last 33 years, located in Fargo. Throughout the years, Treasure Island has become one of the largest precious metal dealers in this region, with many repeat customers in all 50 states. Chris has an in-depth understanding of the current precious metals commodity market, as well as having a keen interest in the history and the use of gold and silver within our nation. Please welcome Chris Olson.
Thank you very much, everybody. It's great to see so many people coming out on this, one of the last nice Saturdays of the year. But this is going to be time very well spent. I'm glad that so many of you could make it today. As Jason said, my name is Chris Olson. I'm with Treasure Island Coins. We've been in business since 1976. Many of you know me. Most of you probably don't, but we sell gold and silver. We help sponsor this event because we believe this is a very subject, and there's not much public understanding of what's happening in this country. Even the least educated people know something is wrong, but how to pinpoint. This mic is going on and off. How to pinpoint the issues that we face, what we can do, how we got to this point. And so I don't have too much to talk about myself. I'm going to want to move it right on to the next speakers because Catherine Austin Fitz and G. Edward Griffin are going to have a lot of very informative information to share with you. And it's very important that we all gain a very keen understanding of what is happening to our country, because if we don't do something about this now, very soon, there won't be anything left to save. It's the goal. It would be my hope that if the goals of the organizers of this conference were actually reached, I would be out of a job. If we met the goals of this conference, I would be out of business. You wouldn't need to buy gold or silver from me because gold and silver would be your money. You would have it in your bank, you would have it in your pocket, and we would have a commodity money standard the way we did back when this country was incredibly prosperous at its founding. And that's what our money is supposed to be, is gold and silver. That's what money is. The paper that we use every day is not money. It doesn't meet the definition of money. And the fact that we have a central bank, an unconstitutional arrangement that prints money and loans it to our federal government, has given them and our government enormous power over our lives. And the Fed needs to be ended, and that's something that Campaign for Liberty and Ron Paul are attempting to do through the Audit the Fed bill in the House and the Senate, and hopefully that will pass and we can audit the Fed and then end it. So briefly, I just want to discuss what money is and what money isn't, because that's the source of all of our problems. Is system, the money that we're using, has given these central planners, these statists, near complete control over our lives. They can inflate, deflate, do whatever they want. They can loan out trillions of dollars to institutions that rightfully should have failed. They can reward failure and penalize success, institutionalizing failure. They have a fiat money system where they just decide this is how they want it to be, and that's what they do. But how did we get tricked into using this money if it's not money? See, money in an economy, in a free market economy, money arises on its own. And at first, economies begin with barter. You've got the baker trading loaves of bread for shoes from the shoemaker. But that's a very inefficient way to run an economy. You cannot support advanced economies on a barter exchange. You can't get enough people to specialize in different occupations. So beginning with barter, you eventually move into some type of a medium that everybody accepts. And I won't get into that too deeply, but let's see. We've had different types of money throughout history. Iron hose in Africa have been used as money. Salt in West Africa. Sugar in the Caribbean. Beaver skins in Canada. Codfish in colonial New England. Tobacco in colonial Maryland and Virginia. Even cigarettes in World War II POW camps. And of course, gold and silver has been the most effective form of money and has been the only true international currency throughout most nations' histories in the last 3,000 or so years. Nearly every country, in fact every country, has used gold and silver. In Zimbabwe right now, if you have Zimbabwe dollars, you get nothing. The only way you can survive in Zimbabwe today is if you have gold grams. And there's a video on YouTube, if you look up Zimbabwe inflation, they're interviewing one of the native ladies there, and she said that it costs her a gram of gold a day to live. And if she doesn't have gold, you can't make it. So the one thing to notice about all those examples I showed you was that all those monies were commodities. And that's what we need, is a commodity money standard. Paper money that we use today is not a commodity. It is not backed by a commodity. It does not represent a commodity. It used to be backed by gold and silver. When they severed the exchange, when they severed the dollar from gold, they basically said, well, you know, this used to be gold, now you can just pretend it's gold. And we've been fooled into doing that ever since, and the whole world is fooled into it as well. And the entire world is on a money standard. The entire world is on a fiat money standard. There is no currency that is backed by precious metals as they ought to be, even though they used to be. And the monetary qualities of gold and silver, what makes it fit to be a good money, a good medium of exchange within an economy, is that it has intrinsic value. One of the most important aspects of it is that it has limited supply. That's very important, that the supply be limited, because when the money supply is increased, that is the definition of inflation. That is what causes prices to go up. And that's what's happening right now, every day, There are trillions and trillions of dollars that they have committed to prop up failing institutions. And instead of coming to you and asking you for your tax money to prop these guys up, they just print it and they take the money right out of the value of your dollar. When the money supply is limited, prices go down slowly over time and living standards increase. And that's exactly what happened in this country between 1793 and 1930s, roughly. The prices continued to go down as goods and services in the economy increased in supply, but the money supply stayed the same. Living standards increased. You know, 2 cars in every garage, only one parent had to work. What happened to that? And it's my contention that it's directly related to our money system, our currency, that we've been fooled into using. So here's a chart that shows the US dollar versus gold. US dollar in red, gold in blue. The increase and the decrease over time. Since 2002 through October 06, it's kind of an old chart, but you can see that gold has increased dramatically while the dollar has been decreasing dramatically. Gold was up 120% at the end of 06, and gold was at about $700 at the time this chart ended. Gold is now over $1,000, and so this chart has continued on the course that you see it here. The M3 money stock in billions of dollars here on this chart, you can see the money supply of our country massively increasing, massively. And we've got here, this is a bond index with, you know, if you had your money in the stock market, you're in the Vanguard bond index, you're getting good dividends. It's got about a 10% return there, but if everything, it's about a 34% return. But at the same time, the value of the dollar decreased by 30%. So even though you made 34% in the Vanguard index funds, you lost 30% of your dollar's buying power. So over 6 years here, you made 4%. But they fooled you into thinking it was more than that. But that's inflation. Here's a quick chart that shows bank bailout pledges to date on the left here. And this was done last year, last fall in 08. This chart was made. It's an old chart as well. But the bailout pledges to date right here compared to the inflation-adjusted cost of World War II. Or far on the right, you have NASA, the Vietnam War, the invasion of Iraq, and so on. It dwarfs them, the amount of money that we've created out of thin air to bail out and save our economy. Abandoning, as George Bush said, we must abandon free market principles in order to save the free market. That's silly. So, at Treasure Island, we sell gold and silver. We do it on a national basis. We're the region's largest dealer, and we're probably in the top 10 or 15 in the country by size, but we're kind of a well-kept. We're able to offer prices, if anyone is interested in owning gold or silver, which I recommend if you don't get it from us, get it from somebody. You need to protect your wealth, and this is one of the best ways of doing it. This is the true international currency. It's hard money. The supply, it doesn't increase much at all through mining. It's too expensive. So they can't print this out of thin air. People need to get gold. If you come see us, we've got some of the best prices around. Silver as well.
Our next presenter is Catherine Austin Fitz. She's the president of Solari Incorporated, the publisher of Solari Report, and managing member of Solari Investment Advisory Services, LLC. Catherine has served as managing director and member of the board of Wall Street investment bank Dillon Read and Company, Incorporated. She was assistant secretary of housing, federal housing commissioner in the first Bush administration, and president of Hamilton Securities Group, a Washington, D.C. investment bank. Catherine has designed and closed over $25 billion of transactions and investments to date, has led portfolio strategy for $300 billion of financial assets and liabilities, and has participated in the private and public workout of billions in mortgage, real estate, and banking fraud. She is a true political and financial insider. Please welcome Catherine Austin Fitts.
Thank you very much. It is, as those who know me know, I do a lot in Montana, and so many times I've driven through North Dakota, and I've wanted to stop, except I didn't know anybody, and so, you know, I kind of drove through, and I said to one of the guys from the Campaign Liberty last night, I said, this is wonderful, because now I feel like I have a home base in North Dakota, so it's really a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to see you, and it's a pleasure to speak with you. The title of what I'm going to talk about tonight is Beyond Bailouts. Now, one of the things that's happened is, who here has been involved with the Campaign for Liberty? Raise your hand. Okay, great. The Campaign for Liberty has brought together great people, state by state, all across the country. It's been an incredible sort of grassroots emergence, thanks to Congressman Ron Paul, who I've been a supporter of for a long time. And so it's sort of really a pleasure to see more Campaign for Liberty people up here in North Dakota. The guys from Campaign Liberty asked me to talk about the bailout. I wanted to talk about the bailouts, but I wanted to talk about beyond bailouts and particularly family wealth. My sort of overview of what's happening right now is we're watching a process that is centralizing wealth, and what we need to do is we need to decentralize it. And if you're going to decentralize wealth, what does that mean you're going to do? You're going to protect family wealth, you're going to build up family wealth. Individuals and families need to get wealthier and stop being drained by large government and large corporations. So I'm very focused on building family wealth. Okay, some smart guy at Yale got geographic information software, and they mapped out all the financial transactions on planet Earth, and they made a picture, and this is the picture. And what you'll see is, if you can see the places where the bars go high, okay, that's where the most financial transactions are. And if you look at a lot of places, there are almost no financial transactions. And that's because what we're doing is we're shipping all of our money into the financial centers. So we're shipping our taxes to Washington, we're shipping our investments to Wall Street, and then they control what comes back and how. And that's all part of this financial centralization process. I call it, sometimes you'll hear me refer to financial coup d'etat. Has anybody heard that expression? I was sitting, you know, there are moments when you have these epiphanies and you really see insight into what was going on. I was sitting with three friends, three other women, and we were just kind of talking about money. And I always ask people about how their money works and sort of where their money's going. And it turned out that one woman who was retired had all of her money in a local bank, and they were a correspondent bank with a large New York bank. And she had her money in CDs, and that money was going into this large New York bank, whose name starts with a C. and the money was going in, and she was getting about, at that time, she was getting about 3% on her CD. So rates have fallen since then, but she's getting about 3%. The woman across from me, these are all very good friends, the woman across from me had her IRA in the stock of the same New York bank, and at the time assumed that she was getting about 5%, including her dividend yield and the improvement in stock. Now, if she kept that stock, she would have lost about 90% at one point, but at the time she thought she was getting about 5%. These two women are providing their savings to this New York bank for about 4%, okay? They're giving them their retirement savings, and they're getting back about 4%, okay? So it turns out that the third woman, had started a business 2 years before, and to finance the start of her business, she did what a lot of entrepreneurs do, and I've done. She borrowed money on her credit card from the same New York bank. And right after she borrowed the money, they raised the rate to 23%. So here we have three friends, right? These two are taking their hard-earned savings and giving it to this bank, and then this bank is lending it back to their best friend for 20%, or it's really what's called on Wall Street a 2,000 basis point arbitrage, right? Now, all the people involved are very honest, hardworking, reasonable people. Why do we need a large bank 1,000 miles away to get in between friends and drain off all that profit? Okay? That's what a financial coup d'etat, it's a little example of what it looks like. Okay, so I'm going to spend a long time with this slide because I want you to have a history. The bailout has a history, and we can go back 2,000 years. But I'm going to start with the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. I'm not going to talk about it very much because you've got Ed Griffin here, who's the, if you're sitting with people like me and you say, what's the one book you should read if you want to understand the Federal Reserve, you say, oh, well, it's The Creature of Jekyll Island. So we literally have the person to talk about the Fed. But it's important that we all understand that the Federal Reserve is not just a central bank. The New York Fed, which is the flagship Federal Reserve, is the depository for the US government, okay? That means it's their bank. And they control the wire and clearing system. So basically all the money that's cleared in the country ultimately has to go through the Fed. And they also run something called the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which is essentially a slush fund, okay, that allows them to intervene in the currency and other markets with very wide latitude with no transparency. And so basically when you say there's a government, yes, there's a government, but the money of that government is operated, managed, and controlled by private banks, not by a government. Okay, very important distinction. In 1947 and 1949, we created two acts that were very important to what's happening today with the bailouts. Does anybody know what they are? Oh, you all are so polite. 1947, we created the National Security Act, and in 1949, we created the CIA Act. And those two acts did one thing that is very important and not commonly understood. They created a vehicle that would allow government money to be secretly shifted out of the federal budget and spent with no transparency outside of congressional control. Has anybody here ever heard of the black budget? Okay. That's an amount of money that's going to secret projects, a lot of military intelligence projects, that is not subject to congressional appropriation or oversight. It's essentially outside of the Constitution, okay? And in 1980, we did a third thing, which is we created an executive order that said that private corporations could do military, high-level military and intelligence functions. What we did is, with a combination of those two laws and that executive order, we created a way for the government to borrow money and outside of congressional appropriation and control and outside of any disclosure or transparency, give it to private corporations to own and control the most powerful technology on the planet. Okay? And a lot of what we're grappling with is what happens when you have a group of private corporations who are free to build private militaries and private empires using our money with no amount of accountability, and you let that go on for 50 years. Okay? They end up in control. Now, one of the things that happened, and I'm not going to get into it, I have an article that's very popular called Narco Dollars for Beginners, and I found myself in a position in the 90s of having to learn about and research about sort of the economics of the narcotics trafficking business, which is something I never wanted to know. But it's intimately connected with mortgage fraud and the history of mortgage fraud, because a lot of narcotics trafficking money has been laundered through real estate and mortgage fraud. And one of the things I discovered over many years is this subprime mortgage. Everybody knows what I mean when I say subprime mortgages? Okay. The subprime mortgage problem didn't start in the last 10 years. It goes back many, many decades, and it relates to how laundering narcotics trafficking money has been leveraged. And mortgage fraud has been a source of incredible resources to the black budget. And over time, it has built up a very significant amount of collateral fraud. Does anybody here know what I mean by collateral fraud? So you know how they were, you know, during the coverage of the subprime mortgage, they said that the mortgages were less than 50 cents of how they've been created. So, you know, they originated a mortgage to somebody who didn't have a job and had no income, and now the mortgage is worth 50 cents on the dollar. Okay, well, that's, at the heart of it, my expectation is not that's the real problem. The real problem is there are 10 mortgages on that house. Okay? You literally have significant amounts of fraudulent paper that have been used to finance a variety of these activities, and has generated incredible amounts of money for parties. So you've printed paper, you've printed massive amounts of paper, you sold that paper to our 401ks, our IRAs, to pension funds all over the world, investors all over the world, people in Hong Kong, everywhere. And so you arrive at a place where you need bailouts, and that's part of the way you arrived at it. Let me just tell you a story before I go on from there. I was speaking in the summer of 2000 to a wonderful group of people called Spiritual Frontiers Foundation International. They're a group of people who are very committed to spiritual evolution of our society, and they have a conference once a year to talk about how they can help our society spiritually. So I've been asked to give a speech about narcotics trafficking and the rise of organized crime in the intersection with government. And so I'm in the middle of the speech, and I'm talking about the fact that in 1999, the Department of Justice had said to a reporter that I was working with that the U.S. economy launders $500 billion to $1 trillion a year of all illegal monies. So that's everything. That's narcotics trafficking, tax evasion, financial fraud. We're the global leader in sort of narco dollars and dirty money. I said to this wonderful audience of people, spiritually committed people, what would happen if we stopped being the global leader in dirty money? And we had a little interactive conversation, and they said, well, you know, the stock market would go down because all that money would leave and go to Hong Kong and Singapore and London instead of coming to the New York Stock Exchange. And we'd have trouble financing the government deficit because we need to borrow money, so we need capital. We'd have trouble rolling over the government deficit. And, you know, and so our taxes might go up and our government checks might stop. And I said, okay, well, let's pretend there's a big red button up here on the lectern. And if you push that button, you can stop all hard narcotics trafficking in your community, your state, and your country tomorrow. Who here will push the button? And out of 100 people dedicated to evolving our society spiritually, guess how many would push the button? 1. So I said to the other 99, why would you not push the button? And they said, we don't want our mutual funds to go down, we don't want our taxes to go up, and we don't want our government checks to stop. So let me just ask you, how many people here would push the button? I push the button. Okay, so maybe 50%? Now, in America, to have a really significant political shift, you need about 80% of the population is sort of the rule of thumb in Washington. So if the president in the United States is going to push the red button, what does he or she need? They need 80% of the people to be fully on board for pushing the red button, right? Okay, now, if the Campaign for Liberty in Fargo, North Dakota is only 50% there, then we're not there yet. Now, in fact, if you talk to most people about why they won't push the red button, it's because we haven't yet had the conversation, how do we make money pushing the red button? Okay, because everybody knows if you just keep liquidating an economy with dirty money and illegal activities, at some point that's a losing game, right? So there is a way, but it takes having a conversation about how you really turn that around. Okay, one of the things you'll find, one of the most dramatic things that is impacting us and is causing what happened with the bailout is what started in the 1990s with the World Trade Organization. If you have never seen, there's a video of Sir James Goldsmith, You can find it on my blog at solari.com/blog. It's an interview that Sir James Goldsmith did in 1994 with Charlie Rose of Bloomberg, where he describes the plans for industrializing agriculture on a global basis and the devastation that it will do to small farmers and the livelihoods worldwide around agriculture. And it's one of the most prescient things I've ever seen, and it very much describes what's going on not only in the United States, but globally in India and Asia. Right now, one of the biggest issues on the global agenda is trying to get what's called the Doha round passed for the next round of centralization of agriculture and control of the seed supply. And that's a very important, if that round goes through, it's going to have a traumatic impact throughout Asia, but here as well. But one of the things that happened with the creation of the World Trade Organization and real efforts to begin to centralize industries globally in extraordinary ways was a decision to shift capital out of Europe and the United States, but particularly North America, and shift it where? Where did we shift all the capital to? Asia, okay? In 1997, I gave a presentation to some of the top pension fund leaders in the country who were on one of my boards. And the presentation was about how we could re-engineer government investment in communities in a way that would create tremendous new financial equity and wealth, and with pension fund investments could ensure that the boomers had enough money behind their retirements and the pension funds got the returns that they needed. The president of CalPERS, everybody know who CalPERS is, the largest pension fund in the country. It's the California Public Employees Pension Fund. The president of CalPERS looked at me, this is spring of 1997, and he said, "You don't understand. It's too late." I said, "What do you mean it's too late?" He said, "They have given up on the country and they are moving all the money out starting in the fall." And that fall was the beginning of federal fiscal 1998. And in that year and the next 4 years, $4 trillion literally disappeared from the federal government. I was part of a group of people in the first Bush administration who got laws passed requiring audited financial statements for the federal government. To this date, the federal government has never complied. They have never once produced an audited financial statement for the federal government. So every year, you give them a 1040 that says, "Here's how my money worked," and every year they say, "You know something, we refuse to reciprocate." Now, that's huge, because if you look at the amount of money that we at least know went missing during that period, that's about $14,000, per family, okay? So $4 trillion went missing during that period and has never been accounted for. Now, people always say, in 1 year, the Pentagon was missing $2.3 trillion. People always say to me, "Oh, well, you can't possibly have that much money going missing in a year." I mean, the year that the $2.3 trillion went missing, the individuals paid in taxes $1.6 trillion, okay? Now, I will tell you, there is a way you can have that much money missing, and that's with securities fraud. You can engage in securities fraud with mortgage securities and with derivatives and treasury securities in a way that will finance the stealing of $4 trillion. Now, what was interesting is no one noticed. No one in America noticed that $4 trillion and huge amounts of private capital, including our own pension funds, were being shifted out and moved to Asia. Do you know why they didn't notice? We were having a housing bubble. Everybody thought that times were good. But they weren't good. We were literally awashing the country in debt, temporarily sort of pumping and dumping the real estate and the stock markets. And while we were doing that, the smart money was getting out. Okay? And if you're more interested in sort of the process of how this worked, there's a story that you can access through my website. It's called Dylan Reed and the Aristocracy of Stock Profits, and it tells the history of how this happened. The important thing to understand is the housing bubble was intentional. They knew what they were doing, and it was a plan, and let me give you an example. In 1994, my company was working as the lead financial advisor to the Department of Housing and Urban Development mortgage insurance funds. And there was a very high-level planning for the mortgage insurance origination for the next 5 years for both the Federal Housing Administration at HUD and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And they were pushing Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to dramatically increase their loans in low-income communities, particularly minority communities, at the same time that they were projecting massive increases on FHA mortgage insurance in the same communities. And I took a look at the initial projections and said to a very senior official at FHA, you can't do this. People are going to have to refinance their mortgages 3 and 4 times a year, including from prison, to make these numbers. And she looked me dead in the eye and said, shut up, it's none of your business. Okay? Because if you look at what has to happen to engineer a housing bubble of this magnitude, you have to change hundreds of government regulations. You have to change laws. It's a massive logistical operation to make that kind of shift. And so it takes, at the highest levels of Treasury and the Federal Reserve, tremendous intentional planning and thinking, which is exactly what happened. But what you did was you bubbled the economy so you could shift incredible amounts of capital out to Asia and into the emerging markets. Now, at the same time, what happened? If you look at every community in America, the number of people who are now dependent on centrally controlled debt or government money has skyrocketed. People in America say to me, why is nobody doing anything? Well, everybody is waiting for the next, trying to make their next interest payment or waiting for the next government check. And literally, our financial dependency has reached a point where it is becoming increasingly hard to do anything. Okay, so we arrive at the bailouts. Let me give you a sense that so far we have given or lent the banks $12 trillion. Now, let me give you a sense of how much $12 trillion is. $12 trillion from the Revolutionary War until 2 years ago, all the borrowings that we had accumulated as a nation, including for World War II, the Korea War, the Vietnamese War, all the wars from the beginning of time, was $12 trillion. So it took from 1776 until 2007 to accumulate $12 trillion in debt. And then in a year and a half, we gave or lent the banks another $12 trillion. Okay? Now, one way to look at that is what we did was we took the remaining resources we had as a nation to support Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and simply, instead of using them for that purpose, gave them to the banks. Now, $12 trillion is enough to finance the collateral fraud, securities fraud, derivative games that I believe were used to basically take over this country in what I would call the financial coup d'etat. So you know what a leveraged buyout is of a company? You buy a company and then pay off the money that you used to buy the company with the cash you get from the company. That's the same. We're looking at one of probably the largest, greatest leveraged buyout in the history of the planet. It's the leveraged buyout of a nation with a nation's own money. Okay. One last story. I was in London in 2001. It was right after 9/11. And I'd been asked by an investment firm in London to give a speech, write a paper and give a speech called The Myth of the Rule of Law. And the myth of the rule of law is talking about the extent to which privatization is being used as a guise to turn over community and government resources to corporations at significant subsidies to market value. So you give corporations big contracts that are above, what you would be paid on an arm's length, or you transfer private assets to them at below market prices. And it amounts to a huge subsidy of the private sector at our expense. The bailout is the latest sort of ridiculous round. So I give this paper, And I'm talking about this process with respect to real estate and housing and government contracting in the United States. And then a wonderful reporter named Ann Williamson gets up and gives a paper on the rape of Russia. If you don't know about the rape of Russia, do a Google search for Ann Williamson. I would recommend highly you read about it. What happened when the wall came down is a group of investors and universities went into Russia and basically looted the place. It's talk about a financial coup d'etat. It was extraordinary and of course laundered huge amounts of capital out of Russia. It's literally sort of a harvesting of the money in a place. What she described in Russia was the same investors, the same universities as the one I described in the United States. And then John Laughlin got up, a wonderful reporter in London, and told the same story about Eastern Europe. And lo and behold, it was the same investors, the same universities. And what we realized is, this is a global plan and a global process. We are centralizing wealth globally, and essentially what we're doing is it's called re-engineering government. We're taking all the assets and we're moving them out of communities and out of governments and putting them into the ownership of corporations. At the same time, we're taking all the corporate liabilities and shifting them back into government. Okay, so the bailouts go to government. I mean, think of corporations as vacuum cleaners that have vacuum cleaned up a huge amount of wealth. And so what we're watching is a transition from nation states to really corporate states, but literally through a process of financial coup d'etat. And the bailouts is simply one piece of that whole sweep. And it's important to see it in the context of that whole sweep, because the most important issue is, what can I do? How do I protect myself and my family? How do I navigate this successfully? How do I make sure my family wealth is building? Because if each one of us can do it, I assure you, we can help to shift the whole thing in a very, very positive way. So it's very important that you see the long-term game here, because that makes sure that your money or time won't be wasted. When I was the Assistant Secretary of Housing, we had something called the Popsicle Index, and I did an actuarial analysis of the FHA portfolio, and I found the most important thing for the health of the FHA portfolio, which at the time was about $300 billion of mortgage insurance, was the Popsicle Index. So let me explain what the Popsicle Index is. The Popsicle Index is the percent of people in a community who believe a child can leave their home, go to the nearest place to buy a popsicle, and come home alone safely. So let me say it again. The Popsicle Index is the percent of people in a community who believe a child can leave their home, go to the nearest place to buy a popsicle, and come home alone safely. Okay? So what's the Popsicle Index in Fargo? Well, when I was a little girl, I grew up in West Philadelphia, the Popsicle Index was 100%. It was unthinkable. We couldn't run up to Spruce Street, play the pins, buy a popsicle, come home. The Dow Jones was about 150, okay? And here's what's happened in America. The Popsicle Index has gone down while the Dow Jones has gone up. And it's very much correlated to the centralization of control into government and corporations, but of private wealth into big corporations. So more and more decisions in a place are being made by big organizations that don't have a connection or relationship in that place. And who's financing that process? Can you guess who's financing that centralization? We are. If I walk around any community in America and I look at the money in the municipality and the money in the churches and the money in your 401k and your mother's IRA and the local investment club and on and on and on and on and on, we are basically financing the very big box stores that are coming in and putting us out of business. Okay? And so the critical issue is, how do you turn that around? How do we start to shift our capital in a way that starts to circulate more either locally or through our networks, whether it's in North America or all around the world, because a lot of the opportunity is going to shift to the countries with the younger populations. There's no doubt about that. How do we shift our capital but in a way that doesn't encourage this kind of centralization. And that's going to be one of the most important issues. You think about, interestingly enough, your capital follows where your time goes, okay? So the first thing that I like to look at when I help a family or a group of people is, where is our time going? Look at the sources and uses of your time, because if your money is going to be safe, first your mind's got to be clear and see what's going on. Now, I did this for a different county. I estimated with a group of people in a county of 200,000, and your metropolitan area is about 200,000 plus people. Is that correct? Okay. We calculated if about 80% of the population, so everybody wasn't very young or very old, was watching 2 hours of TV a day, and you multiply that all out, it turned out to be 140 million hours of TV a year. Okay? And if you look at the number of what a staff year equivalent is in the federal government, that's the equivalent of 70,000 full-time workers. Okay? So if for a county of, say, 225,000 people, if we've literally taken our time and donated the equivalent of 70,000 full-time workers to watching things that encourage and support centralization, then there are no solutions. So step number one is, can you find a way to use that 2 hours a day that makes you wealthier? One of the number one issues you find when you dig into that is the biggest investment that most counties, we have 3,100 counties in America, the biggest investment that most counties make is in what? Our children, our human capital. We raise our children, we educate them, and what happens? They leave. They go into the Army. I live in the South, so we all ship our sons daughters into the military. They go into the military. They go off to the universities, which send them into the financial centers, right? Okay. In my community, a lot of them go into narcotics trafficking and then get shipped off to prison. So if we're centralizing, if we invest an extraordinary amount of time and money in raising our children, and then our children go off and serve the interests of centralization, what's going to happen? We're not going to have the intellectual capital that we need to build small businesses and small farms and healthy economies wherever we are. Okay, I want to just quickly touch on this within the context of time. There are risk issues that we're all facing in the short run. Here's the reality. Our current economy is a war economy. The reason countries all around the world buy dollars and hold them as they go down in value is because it's a global taxation system. We have found a way to tax citizens worldwide to support us through the balance sheet, okay? Why would they buy billions of dollars of securities that go down in value every year? We have the military. We have the intelligence services. We have satellites floating over their territory. We have the ability to insist, okay? Now, the problem with a war economy is it's essentially unproductive. It doesn't encourage natural economic productive, and so you need more and more force to keep it going. Okay, now, let's look at what's been going on in Washington. We keep hearing about swine flu. Okay, if you look at what's going on in swine flu, it's what I call a control excuse. It's a desire to have the ability, for example, to do bank holidays without calling it that. Okay, if you look at the legislation they're trying to get through the states on swine flu, it gives unprecedented control of the economies in ways that even the Patriot Act didn't dream of. Food safety, control of the food supply in a way that makes small farmers and small businesses very uneconomic. All sorts of noise about militia that's not true, but again, an excuse to have more control. Finally, health reform. If you look at the economics of the federal government right now, the average American, our federal debt is up to about $38,000 per citizen. our contingent liability for health care for Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security is what? 191,000. If you look at the US debt clock. Okay, many, many multiples. And so how do you stop that demand from coming through? Well, you reform health care in a way that lets you significantly slash Medicare and Medicaid benefits long term. But you need a lot more control of health care to do that. And that's one of the things that health care reforms. So we have a real effort for greater control. I'm going to skip ahead. Okay, Chris Olson covered this, but this is really important. I really want you to get this into your spirits today. Sorry about all the numbers on the chart. In the beginning of 2003, if you had put $10,000 into a bank CD at 5%, gotten your interest every year, 5-year CD at 5%, gotten your $10,000 back, you would have said, okay, well, that's a successful investment. I got my interest and I got my $10,000 back. If you would put that equivalent money in a bullion fund or in digital gold, or I could have done it with coins, after taxes, you would have gotten back for the same period $19,000. Now, would that have been a successful investment? Well, let's look at it. If you look at this chart, the orange line shows you your precious, your gold investment, not priced in dollars, but in gallons of gasoline. So let's look at purchasing power. So when you made the investment, you could buy 7,000 gallons of gasoline, and when the investment was over, you could make about 7,000 gallons of gasoline. So all you did was hold your purchasing power. That's what you did. But if you kept the dollars, you could buy 3,000 gallons of gasoline. Now, I've done those numbers for a county of $100,000. You add up all the money they have sitting in dollars and fixed income, the different institutions, the municipality, the families, everybody. You count that up. My estimate was that they lost literally $3.3 billion in purchasing power over that period because this phenomenon was happening. If your area is 200,000, then that's almost $7 billion just from having your money sitting in dollars. Very painful. Okay, what can we do? I always like to focus on the most important things. This is a picture, and I'm sorry about the quality, and it shows two rats who were born in the same litter, so they're siblings. And the rat on top was fed and raised on regular soy. And the rat on the bottom was raised on genetically modified soy. Okay? So one of the things I always ask a family when I work with them is, who's your farmer? Okay? Control on this planet has for many centuries, well, for a century and a half, occurred through the control of energy, through oil. And we're coming into a period when that's going to change, and it's going to shift to the control of seed supply and food. Now, you're blessed here. You're in a state where there's strong agriculture. But one of the things you want to think about is the food that you and your family and that you're feeding to your children, grandchildren are getting, is that food healthy? Are they going to look like that rat on the top or the rat in the bottom? Again, a clear mind is essential for anything having to do with protecting and building wealth. But what's happening to your local seed supply and what's happening to your local food supply? Okay, very, very important question when you think about where you want to put your resources. Okay, so I'm going to go through, there are many, many actions we can take. So I'm just going to run through them quickly. Because this all comes down to how do I and my family withdraw and protect myself from the centralization and start to build wealth. And if enough people do it, it can have a dramatic and transformative effect on what's going on. Because remember, we're the ones who are financing it right now. We're the ones in many ways who are supporting it. Okay, so what can I do? And it's very important, whatever we do, that it gives us energy. Okay, so number one, invest in human capital. Invest in your own health, invest in your children, invest in people in your family. This is all about, the Popsicle Index is all about, stopping corporations from draining people and building people back up, number one. Strong local leadership. The communities that do well in this transition are communities that are really in conversation, they're really in cahoots, and they're helping each other in very granular, practical ways try and find a pathway through these different problems and risk issues. Give you a perfect example. Who controls the vaccine exemption authority in this country? Does anybody know? States. It's all controlled by state law. The World Health Organization, Washington, cannot do anything without moving through the states. When Bob Hale told you, control, this war will be fought out at the local and state level, he was absolutely right, and it is absolutely important that we have people of extraordinary, impeccable. During the 2000, 2004, 2008 election, I kept saying, stop spending money on the presidential election and start figuring out who your local sheriff is. He's a person of integrity, and he knows who you are and has your support. So very, very important. If you can avoid dependency on debt and government money in particular, very hard for some of us to do, but it's important to start building ways of supporting yourself outside of those vehicles because they are designed to control you. Demonetize. One of my favorite stories, I had a friend who kept calling me, and she literally, I'm not big on whiners, but she was whining and kept saying, the yields on my stocks are falling. Yields are going down. And then she'd say, my water bill is going up. What am I going to do? Because my yields are falling and my water bill is going up. I said, this is very simple. Sell your stock and build a well. Now, she's in a rural area where she can do it. But that's demonetization. It's like disintermediation. Those three friends of mine, they should have stopped sending their money to the big bank and started financing their friends at 12%. They would have made goo-gobs more money. Their friend would have paid goo-gobs less money. Everybody would have been happier except the big bank. And, do we really care about that? So demonetize. Look for every way you can to invest in your or in your infrastructure so you permanently lower your overhead. That's why what Bob said about property taxes is so important, because a lot of people who've tried to be self-sufficient on the land, the one thing that stops them is they got to come up with, Federal Reserve notes to pay those taxes. So anything you can do to reduce your cost of energy, reduce your cost of food, reduce the amount of cash money you're going to need from the system, whether it's demonetization or de-intermediation, is something that will significantly improve your skills and lower your risk. Okay, build local food sources. Very, very important. I showed you the rats. I don't need to say more. Build knowledge outside the matrix. This notion that healthcare expenses are skyrocketing is one I dispute. And one of the reasons is, who here who has ever seen the documentary on the history of Royal Rife? Anybody ever seen that? Okay, well then you know. The amount of healthcare knowledge and technology which has been suppressed and kept in the closet is extraordinary. I mean, the number of cures that have been developed for cancer, unbelievable. So you can have access to that knowledge now thanks to the internet and more people coming together through things like the Campaign for Liberty. So start building and sharing your knowledge, because our schools and our corporate media, we don't get that knowledge, but it's there. Organize different ways of investing. I encourage people to do circles. I always say, don't worry about if there is a conspiracy. If you're not in one, you need to start one, okay? So, no, but I'm serious, okay? And I worked on Wall Street, I worked in Washington. Conspiracies were the basic form of economic activity. And I don't mean necessarily illegal conspiracies, but people get together, organize, work together to help figure out how to invest and shift their money in a variety of ways that advantage them. And we need to be doing that too, because we're in markets that are very rigged, things are changing. It's very difficult to do by yourself. It makes sense to get together and conspire, particularly if we're going to do local investment, because so much effort has been spent trying to get us to ship our capital to the financial centers and then control how it comes back If we're going to start building bridges and pathways so that the water starts to flow locally, one of my favorite metaphors is my father was a surgeon, and he taught me that when the body is a trauma expert, when the body's in trauma, the body shuts off the flow of blood to the toes and the fingers and the outer limbs, and preserves it for the heart and lungs and whatever. Well, our financial system basically shuts off the blood to the heart and lungs and ships it to the toes. Okay, that's what's happening. But we're the ones who are doing it. So we need to build pathways to start shipping that money either, among people we know locally, investing with our family, or on networks of people we know even globally. Okay, use precious metals. Precious metals in a time like this is an alternative currency. Chris talked about it, so I don't have to go through it more. But if you don't know about precious metals, I would really encourage that you do so. Trustworthy local banks and credit unions. The places in the country that are the strongest have an infrastructure of local banks and local credit unions that have preserved and kept a lot more credit locally. I notice right now, believe it or not, North Dakota is #1 in the economy in terms of state economic performance, and you have your own bank. Okay, global networks. The reality is that globalization is happening not just because a few people at the top want it to happen, it's because our populations are aging, and all sorts of places around the world have young populations that are dynamic. And so we don't need big corporations to invest globally or to know people globally. We can do those networks ourselves. So I encourage you to think that way. Barter, build up local barter. Another one, very quickly, map your local financial ecosystems. I'm giving a workshop in Tennessee very shortly called Mapping Your Local Ecosystems, and I'm using as an example our food stamp contract. In Tennessee, we have 5 million people. 1 million of them are on food stamps. 35 million people in America now get food stamps. We spend $1 billion a year to provide those food stamps, all of it shipping in food from Latin America when there's lots of farmland lying fallow and we're paying these people not to work. Not very economic, but here's the killer. The database and customer service administration is being outsourced to India through JP Morgan Chase. So we're paying people in Tennessee not to work, unemployment, welfare, all sorts of different programs, while we pay people in India to do the customer service for their food stamps. So we're essentially paying twice for the same thing. It's not economic. And if you map your local financial ecosystem, state and local, what you're going to find is there's lots of opportunities to reverse that kind of outsourcing that will reduce local and state government expenses. Okay, a lot of opportunity. Okay, so I want to get to questions, so I'm going to skip over Chris. How do I make this go? Okay. Our website is at solari.com, solari.com. And at my blog, I try and cover what's happening in the financial markets and in the world, particularly in food and health, that impact family wealth. And so I would encourage you, we have an update list. At the website, there's a ton of resources, including something called a silver and gold calculator. I'm a great believer that the way to start a community currency is by the just do it method. We all start using our coins. And one of the tools that people need, particularly shopkeepers need to do that, is they need a calculator that will toggle back and forth between dollars and silver and gold coins. And so we've created one. We're working now on an iPhone app and expect to have that out by the end of the year. So all sorts of resources on the website. There's a store. I publish the Solari Report, which is a briefing once a week, 3 times a month for people. If you don't want to watch the corporate news, our goal is in an hour to get you the essence of what went on that week that is relevant to your wealth. Okay, so beyond bailouts, the economy is centralizing. We need to protect ourselves and shift our own money and shift our own time and shift our own resources. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. Campaign for Liberty is one of the wonderful groups that's making it possible for us to get together and start talking about how we do that. I've got, how long, 10 minutes, Don? Or son? Do I have 10 minutes for Q&A? Okay. Okay, thank you very much.
G. Edward Griffin is a writer and a documentary film producer with many successful titles to his credit. He is the famed author and researcher of the book, The Creature from Jekyll Island. Mr. Griffin is a recipient of the coveted Telly Award for Excellence in Television Production. He's listed in the Who's Who in America. He is well known because of his talent for researching difficult topics and presenting them in clear terms that all can understand. He is also the founder and president of Freedom Force International. Without further ado, I am so very, very pleased to be able to introduce to you G. Edward Griffin.
Well, thank you so much, Renee, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I got a little piece of business to discuss first before I get to my presentation. In a few minutes, somebody will be passing around a couple of clipboards, and if you wish, you can give me your email address, and if you do that, I'll give you a free subscription to my weekly news service called Unfiltered News. People seem to like it, so if you'd like to receive it in your email box, just give me your email address. And I'll keep it very private. I won't share it with the CIA or anybody like that. Well, I guess some of you folks are familiar with this topic of the Federal Reserve. Many of you have even read the book, The Creature from Jekyll Island. And I understand that some of you have heard either in person or by way of a audio recording my original presentation on this topic. I think of what do they call it, the original recipe, when restaurants change their recipe after a while and then they say, well, the customers didn't like that, so they go back and offer the original recipe. I have an original recipe for a talk on this topic, and although most people think that the title of the talk is The Creature from Jekyll Island, it's not. The real title was An Appearance of the Fourth Kind. And I'm not going to cover all of that today because it's quite long. It takes about 90 minutes to plow through it. Those of you who have your CD recording know that it goes on and on and on. And we don't have time for that today, but I do think that in order to put my later remarks into the proper perspective, I should give you a kind of a condensation of this appearance of the fourth kind. And then we'll move on to the more current issues of what's happening today and what's the significance of all this history, especially as it applies to the future. So what is this appearance of the fourth kind? Actually, that relates to a quotation from a rather obscure philosopher by the name of Epictetus. It comes from the 3rd century BC. And Epictetus is the guy that said, appearances are of four kinds. Either things are as they appear to be, or they neither are nor appear to be, or they are but do not appear to be, or they are not and yet appear to be. Everyone got that? Sure. I always thought that if Epictetus were alive today, he'd probably be head of the Federal Reserve System. And I chose it because it's kind of a mind twister. I chose it as the title of that original talk because if there's anything that is an appearance of the fourth kind, it's the Federal Reserve System. And I know you remember that fourth one. Those are things which are not and yet appear to be. So that's the Federal Reserve System. It appears to be a lot of things which it is not. And as Renee already said, she found out early on that it is not a federal agency, and it's much like, Federal Express. instead of being like the federal government. But that's just one of the many things that it appears to be, but it is not, and probably the least important of them all. But anyway, I gave you that business of the appearance of the fourth kind mainly not because it was necessary, but because I have fun doing it. So let's get on to the main thing. The main thing, of course, in a presentation of the serious material is to tell a couple of jokes. So I will tell you a couple of jokes. My favorite genie jokes, as a matter of fact. I love genie jokes. The first one is this young fellow was going through the alley, and he came across this bottle, and he polished the bottle, popped the cork out, and out came the smoke, and there was this huge genie that appeared before him. And he said, "I am the genie, and you have released me from the prison of the ages, and I will give you 3 wishes." And the little kid looked up at him and said, "Golly, genie, that's wonderful." He said, I always wanted a basketball." And the genie said, "Vroom, there's your basketball." The kid was bouncing the basketball, and they said, "Gosh, genie, I want a new bicycle." "Vroom," said the genie, and there was a brand new bicycle. And the kid was so excited, he said, "I'm kind of thirsty. Genie, make me a malted." The genie said, "Vroom, you're a malted." Okay, genie joke number 2. Fellow walks into a bar, and with him is this ostrich. And they both go up to the bar and sit on a bar stool. The bartender came over. He'd never seen an ostrich in his bar before. So he looked at these two, and he said, "Well, sir, how can I help you?" And the man said, "Well, my friend and I, we would like a drink. I would like a vodka martini, please." And he turned to the ostrich and said, "What would you like?" And the ostrich said, "Oh, whatever you like is fine. I always like what you like. I'll have one too." Well, the bartender was almost, beyond himself. He had never seen an ostrich in the bar, least of all a talking ostrich. So he shook his head. He went over and got a couple of vodka martinis. He came back. A few minutes later, he said, "Would you like another drink?" And the man said, "No, that's quite enough." And he said, "What about you?" And the ostrich said, "Oh, no, whatever you say is fine. If one is enough, that's fine. I always like what you do." So that was it. The man said, "How much?" The bartender looked at the bill. It was $14.82 with taxes. $14.82. So the guy reached in his pocket, pulled out everything he had, dumped it out on the bar, sorted it out, and it was exactly $14.82. An amazing thing. So they left. The next day they came back. The same guy and the same ostrich sat on the same stools at the bar. Same bartender came over and said, "Well, would you like a vodka martini today?" And the man said, "No, I think I'll have a whiskey sour today." And he turned to the ostrich, "What would you like?" The ostrich said, "Oh, whatever you like is fine with me. I always like what you like. I'll have one also." So the same routine, got the whiskey sour, no more after that. One was enough. "How much is the drink?" The bartender looked at the tab, and it was $12.52, including tax. So he reached in his pocket, pulled out everything he had, dumped it out, sorted it out, and it was exactly $12.52. Amazing. Well, this went on for every day for the week. At the end of the week, the bartender said, "Look," to the guy, he said, "Look, I have to ask you a question." He said, "This is the most amazing thing I have ever seen. Not only is there an ostrich in my bar, but a talking ostrich, but the amazing thing is that no matter what the bill is, and you've had a different drink every day, it's a different amount, you reach in your pocket, you pull out everything you've got, and everything on the table adds up to exactly what the bill is. How do you do that?" The fellow said, "Well, I'll tell you a story." He said, "One day I was walking through an alley, and I came across this bottle. And I rubbed the dirt off the bottle, pulled the cork out, and out came this smoke, and there was a genie right before me. And the genie said, 'You have released me from my prison of the ages. I will grant you 2 wishes. And the guy said, "Golly, this was my big opportunity." He said, "All right, genie," he said, I wish that from here on, for the rest of my life, no matter what I want, no matter what it costs, I'll be able to reach in my pocket and I'll have enough money to pay for it, no matter what it is." And he said, "From that day forward, Every time I've wanted something, it didn't make any difference whether it was a couple of drinks or an automobile or a yacht or a trip around the world, I always had the right amount of money in my pocket. And he said, the other thing, my second wish, he said, I told the genie, he said, you know, genie, I always wanted a chick with long eyelashes and long, slender legs that would agree with everything I said. Silly, huh? Well, believe it or not, there's a reason for telling those genie jokes. And that is, there's a lesson to be learned there, even though it's a joke. In real life, we must be very careful what we wish for, because when we get it, it may not be exactly what we thought it was going to be. Now, that applies to this topic, and you'll see how in just a moment. In presenting a topic as complex as this, I find that it's sometimes useful to discipline myself in preparation, to boil everything down into a soundbite, one sentence or maybe two at the most. Condense, get it down, short. Then you'll have the essence of it, and then you can build on that. And so I have come up with 2 sentences. This is actually a 2-part presentation. Part 1. In 1913, the Federal Reserve System was created because Americans made a wish to the government genie, and that wish was to control the banks on behalf of the people. But what they got was a banking cartel that now controls the government. Statement number 2. Today, Americans are making another wish to the government genie, this time to create unlimited quantities of money to protect them from hardship. But what they are getting is unlimited quantities of money being used to deprive them of their freedom. Now, in essence, that's everything I want to say today, and probably a lot of you already got it. So if you want to go to sleep, that's okay, but I'll drone on for the rest of you and fill in some of the details. Let's get right into that first part, that first summary statement, which is kind of an overview of the book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, and an overview of the story. Let me give you a condensed version of that. The reason for the title of the book, as many of you know, The Creature from Jekyll Island, is not just because it has a kind of a mysterious sound to it. Sometimes people associate that with the creature from the Black Lagoon, or something, or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, these mystery stories. But the truth of the matter is that Jekyll Island is a real island, and it's off the coast of Georgia, and it was on that island back in 1910 that the Federal Reserve System was created. So it has historical significance. But more than just the location, the circumstances surrounding that meeting were really the giveaway as far as I was concerned when I was doing research. The circumstances were that the meeting was held under conditions of great secrecy. By that I mean is that the participants in the meeting denied that they were there. They denied that they were going. They were instructed to arrive at their rendezvous one at a time, not to be seen together, and all of that sort of thing. And a lot of secrecy, which I'll go into more detail in just a moment, was surrounding that meeting, and I found that to be very curious. Why the secrecy? Because I knew that when things are done in secret, there's usually something to hide, and I was curious to know, what was it they were trying to hide? Well, I found out. It wasn't hard. It was sort of there, out in the open, but certainly nothing that I learned in school. And in my research, I went through a lot of school textbooks for students who were at a higher level than I was on this topic of money and banking, and none of the information I discovered about the reasons for the secrecy were found in any of those textbooks. And it's certainly nothing that you find in the nightly news. It's one of those appearances of the fourth kind actually showing up again. But let's recount that story in some detail. It was November of 1910 when Senator Nelson Aldrich and 6 other men met at the New Jersey Railroad station, and they were instructed, as I mentioned a moment ago, to arrive at the station. It was late in the evening, one at a time, not to dine together, not to be seen together in public, to avoid newspaper reporters at all costs, they were told. Because in those days, before the era of television or airline travel, all of the dignitaries from New York, if they were traveling, had to go in and out through the New Jersey Railroad station. And so it's a big hustly bustly station, and newspaper reporters used to hang out there like paparazzi. They'd wait for some celebrity to show up, and they'd get the picture and maybe catch a few words, a short interview, and that's how it was done. And so these men were told to avoid those newspaper reporters, and one of the men carried a shotgun in a big black case. So in case he had been accosted by a newspaper reporter, he was prepared to say that he was going on a duck hunting trip. We find out from his children and from his biographers who wrote about this event in later years that this man didn't own a gun, never fired a gun in his life, and that was a borrowed shotgun just for the purposes of deception. When they got on board this private railroad car owned by Senator Nelson Aldrich, picture that, a private railroad car, like owning your own jet today, I suppose, or maybe more. They were told when addressing each other in the privacy of this car to avoid using their last names, to talk to each other and mention first names only. And 2 of the men out of the 7 abandoned their first names and adopted code names, even in the privacy of this conversation inside that car. I thought, boy, that's strange. I wonder if it really happened that way. And then I found out that it really did happen that way because one of the members, one of the participants, wrote about it in later years, an article that appeared in the Saturday Evening Post. It was many years after the Federal Reserve was passed into law. And then they began to talk about it, because by then the Federal Reserve was becoming almost revered by the average American as a great American institution. And then they began to talk openly about it, but at the time, no, taboo topic. And so this man wrote about it, and he said the reason for using first names only is because they were concerned that the servants on board the train would pick up the names and then talk about it. And that if the word leaked out through the servants on this private car, and the community might learn it through gossip, and then some newspaper reporter would pick it up, and somebody would find out that all of these important people were together at one time going to Jekyll Island, then the whole purpose of this meeting would have been subverted. It goes on and on and on. There are many other areas of secrecy, and it certainly aroused my curiosity as what is it that they were trying to hide? Well, they traveled for 2 nights and a day, 1,000-mile journey, down to Brunswick, Georgia. The train now goes to Jessup, Georgia. I'm not quite sure how they got there. Must have been a side track that goes from Jessup to Brunswick. I was just there a few months ago revisiting Jekyll Island, and I took the train just to see what it might have felt like on that journey. And we got off in Jessup and then had to take a bus to go to Brunswick. But at the time, according to the journals and the diaries and the written records of the participants, they went all the way to Brunswick, Georgia. When they got off the train in the morning, they were met and taken to the inland strait there where there was a ferry boat that took them across the water and to the island. And once they got to the island, they went to this big, beautiful clubhouse, which is still standing, by the way. Now, Jekyll Island, I need to tell you, in those days was a privately owned island. It was called the Jekyll Island Club. And it was the personal property of a very small group of very wealthy billionaire families from New York, people like J.P. Morgan William Rockefeller and their business associates. It's where their families went to spend the cold winter months. And they built beautiful mansions there. They called them cottages. You should see them. They're beautiful things. And if you're interested in architecture, it's kind of the example of the height of Victorian architecture from that period. The clubhouse is the important focus here because it's there that these men went, and they spent the next week there in that clubhouse, sitting around a little table in a small room, which you can visit today if you go to the clubhouse. Go down to the end of the hall, and just before you walk out the back door, look to your left, and there's a sign on this door, and on the sign, a little plaque, says Federal Reserve. That's the room where these men met. And if you go in, you see their pictures on the wall. So this is not a secret. The club is very proud of that history. I got a lot of it, as a matter of fact, from the archives and the museum right there on Jekyll Island, where the ladies who were the historians and kept all these records were very happy to share some of the things they had in their files. I got some photographs from them and some handwritten notes from the participants and letters of correspondence about the event and so forth. And as an interesting aside, this really tickled me. If you go to Jekyll Island today and you go to the bookstore, you might ask them for The Creature from Jekyll Island. They sell a lot of them there. I couldn't believe it. But they do. They're one of our best customers. So anyway, the history is valid history. It all comes from original sources. And the fact is that these men sat around that table in that room for a week, and they hammered out all the important details of the Federal Reserve System. And then they got back onto the train, another 2 nights and a day, back to New Jersey, then back into the environs of Wall Street. And as I said before, it wasn't until after the Federal Reserve System was enacted into law, which was 3 years later, 1913, only after that did they begin to talk openly about their participation. All right, the main point is, why the secrecy? It's very, very simple. In fact, I'll quote to you, one of the participants was Frank Vanderlip. And, well, before I quote from him, first of all, I probably should tell you who these characters were. Would that be of interest to you? I would think so. There were 7 of them. I've already mentioned one of them. Well, I mentioned 2 of them just now because I said Frank Vanderlip. He was the second one. But the first one was Senator Nelson Aldrich. Now, Aldrich was the chairman of what was called the National Monetary Commission. The National Monetary Commission was the committee of Congress which was given the task of drafting the Federal Reserve Act, proposed legislation to do what? Banking reform, they called it. Whenever they want to steal money from the American people or to reduce their liberties in some way, they always give it the word reform or some kind of a nice sounding name to the legislation, the Patriot Act or something like that. You know that the more pleasing the title to the bill is, probably the worse it is. I've come to that conclusion years ago, but in these days that art was still being refined. But nevertheless, they called it a banking reform bill. And the idea was to control the banks. You see, in those days, there was a lot of concern on the part of the American people over the concentration of power into the hands of a small group of financial institutions on Wall Street. In the vernacular of the day, they called that the money trust. If you had a chance to do as I did in my early days of research of going through all this microfilm, you know, this is before the internet. If you wanted to research this stuff, down to the library you go, and you get these rolls of microfilm, and you just crank through to see all the back issues of the New York Times and all the newspapers that you want to look at. And over and over again, I saw this phrase come past as I was reeling the film. Break the grip of the money trust. The money trust this, the money trust that. And that became, in fact, a campaign slogan for some of the better-known politicians. They told the people that they wanted to break the grip of the money trust. And, of course, the people loved that. People like Woodrow Wilson, for example, used that as a theme in his campaign, all the while he was being financed by the money trust. And people didn't know that, however. That was a backroom deal. And of course, when he was in office, he promoted the legislation for the money trust, and he defended it and advanced it in every way possible. But nevertheless, there was a genuine concern on the part of most people. They were concerned over the concentration of power in the hands of the money trust, and the purpose of the Federal Reserve Act was advertised as being a means of breaking the grip of the money trust and putting control of the banks into the hands of the people through their trustworthy elected representatives in Washington. And Senator Nelson Aldrich was in charge of the committee to draft that legislation. Now, he was an associate of J.P. Morgan. He was father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller, Jr. He was the grandfather to Nelson Rockefeller, who became our vice president years later. Just the kind of guy who's going to break the grip of the money trust. The next man on board, I could talk more about Aldrich, but remember, this is a condensed version. Abraham Piatt Andrew was the second man on board, and he was the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. It doesn't tell you too much about him. He was really a banker. He comes from a banking family and banking contacts. That's the reason he was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. Just like all of our Treasury officials of late come from banking, do they not? Or come from the Federal Reserve, which is the banking cartel, and so forth. Later on, Andrew became a congressman, and that still doesn't tell you very much. But he was one of those interesting characters that went to Moscow during the Bolshevik Revolution, and he and a small group of other very powerful bankers from New York literally purchased operating control of the Red Cross in those days, and they had themselves appointed as officers of the Red Cross. And they went to Moscow posing as Red Cross officials. This is big bankers I'm telling you about. I've got some pictures in my book of these guys standing in front of a Red Cross ambulance, and they're all bankers. And they went there for the sole purpose of donating money to all the factions in the revolution to make sure that no matter who came out ahead, they would have contacts with them, friendly contacts. And they funded huge amounts, millions of dollars in those days, directly to the Bolshevik Revolution. Abraham Piatt Andrew was one of the key figures in that. So you see, he was quite an interesting person, more than just an attendant at this meeting on Jekyll Island. Frank Vanderlip was there. He's the guy I started to quote a moment ago, and I will get to him. He was the president of the National City Bank of New York, which was the most powerful of all of the banks at that time, representing the financial interests of William Rockefeller and the investment house of Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Henry Davison was there. He was the senior partner of the J.P. Morgan Company. Charles Norton was there. He was president of the First National Bank of New York, another one of the giants. Benjamin Strong was there. He was head of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust Company. He later became the first actual operating head of the Federal Reserve System. And Paul Warburg was there, probably the most important person from a technical point of view. He was a full partner of Kuhn, Loeb and Company, and he was a representative of the Rothschild banking dynasty in England and France. And of course, his brother was Max Warburg, who remained in Europe as head of the Warburg Banking Consortium in Germany and the Netherlands. A very, very wealthy and powerful individual in his own right. Now, you add up all of these individuals, and according to estimates at the time, these are not my estimates, but estimates right in the newspapers at the time, because these were famous people. They were always in the news. It was estimated that those 7 men and the financial institutions that they controlled held within their control 1/4 of the wealth of the entire world. Think about that for a minute. This concentration of wealth into the hands of 7 men and the institutions which they represented, 1/4 of the wealth of the entire world, and this is the group that's going to break the grip of the money trust. So, why the secrecy, ladies and gentlemen? Frank Vanderlip answers the question in this article in the Saturday Evening Post. He says, if it were to be exposed publicly that our particular group had got together and written a banking bill, that bill would have had no chance whatsoever of passage in Congress. Duh, of course. These people were the money trust, and the American voters and the other congressmen who weren't too bright at the time would have figured out the scam. And so the necessity for absolute secrecy was paramount. Now, there's something else to be learned from this meeting on Jekyll Island. More than the fact that there was a ploy, a deceptive ploy, that you weren't supposed to know who was actually doing this, but think about the characteristics of these men and the institutions that they represented. Here we had representatives of J.P. Morgan, the Rockefellers, indirectly the Warburgs, the Rothschilds, all of these people sitting around a table for a whole week hammering out some kind of an operating agreement. That should sound strange to you because these people were competitors. These were the very banking and financing institutions that prior to this point in history were butting heads against each other, competing for dominance in the financial markets of the world. London, Paris, New York, blood all over the battlefield as they fought for dominance. And now they're coming together and coming to an agreement. And this is made easy to understand when you realize that this was the point in history that sometimes is described in the history books as the era of the dawning of the cartel. And some historians refer to it as the dawning of the monopoly. Essentially the same concept. Prior to the turn of that century, America had grown and prospered primarily through a principle of free enterprise competition. Unlike the old world in England, where everything had to be chartered by the royal government, you had to have contacts to do this, you had to have a corporation that was granted by royal charter to do that, all rules and regulations, everything was fixed. No, in this country it was free enterprise competition. Go out and do it, man. Produce it cheaper, provide a better service, faster, cheaper. Let the best man win the race. And I believe that's the reason that in such a short period of time, this country went from a wilderness and surpassed Europe in productivity and services and art. Maybe not culture, but certainly in almost every other field. But then those who reached the top, the pinnacle of success in this race to the top, decided that competition was no longer a good thing. John D. Rockefeller is quoted by all of his historians, his biographers, as saying, competition is a sin. And people like Rockefeller and Carnegie began to apply their power and their wealth to bring about a change in America, to eliminate competition, to create monopolies and cartels. Cartels in which different corporations, all in the same field, decide not to compete with each other anymore, but join together and come to agreements to reduce or eliminate areas of competition, to do price fixing, or to divide up areas, geographical areas, or to share patents and processes. You make automobiles, I'll make tractors. You have North America, I get South America. We'll sell the same product, but we'll compete on brand name, but not on price. And that was beginning to happen already at that point, and it was, by the time this meeting took place, that process was in full swing. And suddenly, if we understand that phase of history that was being played out during the meeting of Jekyll Island, it just jumps off the history pages and hits you right in the forehead. These men created a banking cartel. And you're not going to find that in the textbooks. But that's what it is. these men decided to stop competing, and they drew up a banking cartel between themselves. They said, we will now dominate the banking industry. This is our cartel agreement. You must do this, we'll do that, and this is how we'll regulate it, and this is how we keep the competition under control. This is how we maintain control and avoid competition. And then they went to Congress, and they convinced the congressman that this was all in the best interest of the people because the people were clamoring for a means of breaking the grip of the money trust, and they said to Congress, this will do it, and the congressmen all voted it in. In other words, the congressman passed the cartel agreement into law. Now, without that, cartels always have a hard time controlling their agreements. If you have an oil cartel, for example, and you've got an agreement with various countries in a certain part of the world, you're going to limit production of your oil, or you're going to stand firm on the price per barrel of your oil, or whatever it is, to keep the prices up and to keep competition down. If one of the members of the cartel says, I don't want to do this anymore, I quit. We need more money. We think we should have a bigger share of the market than we have. We don't like this cartel agreement anymore. We quit. There's nothing the others can do about it. Oh yes, sometimes they play dirty, they bring in the jackals and all that sort of thing, but quite often that's not successful because they're talking about big cartel members and they all have access to jackals. So assassination is not always the easy way out. So they can't do anything about it unless they bring the government into partnership. Now, if they can do that, bring the government in and take this cartel agreement and make it a law, now none of the members can back out of it, because if they do, they're breaking the law and they go to jail. All cartels have this affinity to government for that very reason. First time I became aware of that was years ago. I became aware of one of the better known cartels, sometimes referred to as the Dairy Association. A bunch of the farmers in the Midwest decided that there was too much competition. The price of milk was going down, you had to compete. So they got their nice local representatives into the act and said, we're going to pass a, what do they call it, a fair trade bill. A fair trade bill. Doesn't that sound good? And the fair trade bill was to make sure that everybody can afford milk. Babies need milk, young people need milk, everybody needs milk. And we don't want prices to go skyrocketing, so we're going to have a fair trade bill which regulates the price of milk so everybody can afford it. And of course, the immediate result is that the price of milk went up, which is what it was designed to do. This is how cartels always work, in the name of protecting the people. And that is exactly what happened on Jekyll Island, except in this case it was a banking cartel. Now, what is the advantage to these two groups? We've got government on the one side and we've got the bankers on the other side, and they formed a partnership to give legal substance to a cartel. Why did they do this? Well, whenever there are two partners in a venture, they have to have some kind of an advantage or they wouldn't be in it. So let's take a look at the advantages. And we'll start with the government. Why are the politicians participating in this? To answer that question, in fact, to answer both questions, we must understand how money comes into being. You're going to think I'm making this up, I know, although you've been softened up a little bit by the video you saw, and Catherine gave you a lot of excellent information, so maybe this won't sound so bizarre when you hear it from me. But I'm going to give you the short version of it, and I can guarantee you, although it is oversimplified, it is absolutely correct in principle. Here's how it works. Congress needs more money. Congressmen always need more money because the more money they spend, the more popular they are, the more votes they get, and they're assured of a nice job and a retirement. But they need the money in order to provide benefits, of course, but they don't want to tax the people directly, because when you raise taxes, well, then you get unpopular, and then you're not reelected. And so the politicians always have this problem. How do I increase spending without increasing taxes? Well, the solution is the same for politicians as it is for individuals, and that is you can get more money than you earn one of two ways. You can steal it, which we won't even go into that because that's a very popular method in government, or you can borrow it. Now there we have the solution, because that sounds almost honorable. I mean, everybody has to borrow money now and then, so why not the government? So they borrow it. And they do this by getting the printing presses on, and they print these little certificates with fancy edges around the side. Across the top, they call them Treasury bonds or bills or notes, depending on the term of the repayment, how long it is. But they're IOUs. That's all they are, just IOUs. And so the government offers IOUs to the public or to anybody that wants to, quote, invest in the bonds. And so they borrow the money from people who give the money on loan to the government. All right? The only trouble with that is that they get the money they need short term, but in 30 days, 60 days, or a year, or 5 years, whatever the term of the loan, that money has to be paid back. Has to be paid back with interest. Lo and behold, when that happens, the politicians still are not collecting enough money in taxes to pay for their current expenses, much less to pay for the old loans that they took out. So they can't do it. Not to worry, if you're a good politician, just borrow some more. Borrow some more, this time to pay back the original loan plus the interest, and plus some more, by the way, in order to pay the increased boondoggles that you're engaged in, the giveaways, the benefits. And so each time these loans come due and they are turned over and over again, the government has to borrow money to cover the old loans plus some new ones. And so we have this thing that everybody knows as the expanding national debt. It just keeps growing and growing and growing and growing. And not very many people give a thought as to, is there an end to that process? What's it going to do? They think it's going to just grow forever. And I can assure you that the politicians who are voting for these loans have no intention of ever repaying that. At least not in the way that you and I would think of repaying it. They will repay it. Well, they won't repay it exactly. You will repay it by a process which I will make clear in just a moment. And so that's how they get the money, more than what they're taking in taxes. Even that, however, is not sufficient, because in order to get ever-increasing amounts of money, and that's what happens after time, they have to keep increasing the interest rate in order to attract investors to put up all of that money. I mean, we're talking about billions and trillions of dollars. There isn't that much money out there for investors to put in unless they really jack up the interest rates so that, 50% return, maybe they'll get some more money invested. They can't do that. And so now there's always a shortfall. There's a certain amount of money that the government cannot borrow from individuals or corporations or investment funds or other countries and other financial institutions and so forth. So what do they do with the shortfall? This is where the Federal Reserve System comes in. For the shortfall, now the politicians go down the street to the Federal Reserve building, and imagine this in your mind. The Treasury official walks into the Federal Reserve building, into the officer's office there, and the president of the Federal Reserve says, "Come in, sir, please sit down. We've been expecting you." Of course, he goes in there every day. And it's, "How much money do you need today?" And the Treasury official says, another $1 billion today would be fine. Oh, make that 2. The Federal Reserve officer opens his drawer, pulls out a big checkbook. Now, mind you, it's not a checkbook. They do this in computers, right? Click, 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 and it's done, all digital. But imagine, he pulls out a checkbook, and he writes a check and says, "What is that, $2 billion? Okay, here it is." He signs it and gives it to the Treasury official. It says, thank you very much. Treasury official now takes that $2 billion check, deposits it into the government's checking account, into one of the banks, into the federal system. And now the government has on its balance sheet $2 billion more than it had a moment ago, and now it can start writing checks against that to pay for its military ventures, to foreign aid, to pay off dictators around the world, whatever it needs to do with the money. Now you might ask, well, where did the Federal Reserve get that $2 billion? Who put the money into the Federal Reserve System that they can loan it out like that? What account? Well, the fact of the matter is that there is no account. Nobody put any money into the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve simply created $2 billion with the stroke of a pen or the click of a key on a computer. Just created it. Now, if you and I were to do that, we'd go to jail. But they can do it because their friends in Congress want them to be able to do it, because their friends in Congress want the money. They need that money. They can't get it through the normal channels of loaning at the interest rates they're willing to pay. They need that money, so they pass a law called the Federal Reserve Act, which makes it legal for the Federal Reserve System to just create money out of nothing and go through the appearance of loaning it to the federal government. So the money just comes from nowhere, and now it's into the system. Now, that's just the beginning. If you think that's interesting, wait till you hear the next part. By the way, this first part is why the federal government or the politicians like the system a lot, because they know, even if they don't understand all of the intricacies and the technicalities, they know that no matter how much money they need, it can be created at the drop of a hat by the Federal Reserve System, a fact which we have seen demonstrated in recent months, where they can just, by raising a bunch of hands and say, yeah, we vote for it, the Federal Reserve System accepts the order, and they create the money in trillions and trillions of dollars. That money, ladies and gentlemen, did not exist anywhere in the universe until they just authorized it. Now, that's why the politicians like it. Why are the banks in it? This is where it really gets interesting. Let's take $1,000 of that $2 billion we just created, and let's follow it. $1,000 is given to the postal worker who delivers your mail. He's a federal employee. He's got a $1,000 check. It's a government check. Perfectly good. Everybody will honor that. Not realizing that just a day ago that money didn't exist anywhere in the universe, but it's there now. So the postal worker takes it and he deposits it into his private checking account in a local commercial bank. Now that money is out of that Federal Reserve government loop and it's into the commercial banking loop, and this is where it heats up. If I were the president of that bank, I could go to the front of the bank, and anybody that was standing there in the waiting area, I could say, attention everybody, I'm the president of the bank, and I want to tell you that this gentleman over here has just deposited $1,000 into our venerable bank. Isn't that good news? And people would say, yes, that's good news, because most of them are there to borrow money, and they know that the more money the bank has to loan, usually the lower the interest rate, so it sounds like good news. And this gentleman over here might say, yes, but $1,000 doesn't cut it. Is that all that was deposited? And I say, yep. Well, he would say, I'm sorry, I'm looking at a $9,000 car, a second car for my wife, and just get the groceries and that sort of thing. And I need $9,000, but you've only got $1,000. As the bank president, I would say, sir, don't worry about that at all. We'll take care of that. It's all quite complicated. I'm sure you won't understand it, but we can loan you $9,000 on that $1,000. And as incredible as that may sound, it is true. It's all quite legal. It's all set up. It's all authorized by the Federal Reserve Act, passed into law, made quite legal. And the fact of the matter is, for every $1,000 on deposit, a bank can create an additional $9,000 out of thin air and loan it out. The rules and the regulations are that the banks only have to hold 10% of the money in reserve. That means in the vault or somewhere on a bookkeeping sheet. 10% in reserve. So all I have to do is take that $1,000, put it under a label, a column that's labeled reserves. All right, I got 10% reserves. That means I can loan $9,000 and create $9,000, put it out and loan. I've got 10% in reserve, right? So I'm legal. That's how it works. Not quite that simple. It's got to go out and come back, out and back. About 7 or 8 times out the door and back, it's done. That means, ladies and gentlemen, that for every $1 billion that's created out of thin air by the Federal Reserve for use of the federal government, the private banking system can create an additional $9 billion out of thin air and push it into the economy in the form of loans. That is how money comes into existence in the United States and most of the world today. It's called fractional reserve banking. And most people have no knowledge of it, not much interest in it, except the banks, of course. And they thought it was working just fine. They didn't realize that there were certain principles underneath that were at work, that there were certain doomsday mechanisms at work under any such system that would bring the whole thing down eventually. And that is exactly what's happening today. Now notice that when the federal government gets money created out of nothing, it doesn't, well, it does, I should say. It uses it for its own purposes. It spends it for projects which the government wants and undertakes. It uses it for itself. But when the banks create money out of nothing, they don't use it for their projects. They loan it to you and to me for our projects, and we're very grateful, especially if we think we're getting a good interest rate. So it's our projects. So why would the banks do this? Well, it's very simple. They do it because they collect interest on it. Now, I'm glad you're all sitting down for this. When you give this some thought, they are collecting interest on nothing. You've got to say that over and over in your mind several times before it really sinks in. You think they're charging interest on money that existed before you walked into the bank, that somebody put in there under deposit, and that they got to pay these people for the money that they put into savings and all of that sort of thing. No, no. That money was created out of thin air, and you're paying interest on nothing. Not too shabby. Many people say, gee, I should have been a banker. Why didn't I think of this? Well, if you had thought of it, you might have been tempted, but when you think it all the way through, you find out it's terribly, terribly dishonest, and in my book, it's even criminal. But it's quite legal, and there's a difference between being dishonest or unethical and being legal. Now, okay, I have to cut this short, except to say that this process which I just described has a consequence. That means that the money supply is constantly being expanded. Yes, when those loans are paid back, the money supply reduces. That's true. If you borrow $1,000 from my bank, that's $1,000 in new money. So the economy, the total money supply expanded by $1,000. But later when you pay it back, it goes back out of existence. $1,000 goes back into the vault or into the inkwell or into the computer chip from which it came. So now the money supply decreases by $1,000. That is true. But you have to look at the net effect, which is under such a system, the money supply always expands. There's always new money going into it, more than the old money that's coming back out of it, because otherwise it cannot sustain itself. It's a Ponzi scheme. You constantly need new money, more loans, more debt in order to give it the appearance of success, just like a Ponzi. Once it starts to stabilize or contract, it all falls apart, which is why these people are so desperate now to vote trillions and trillions of dollars and pump it back into the banking system, because now the money is starting to go out of it and it cannot sustain. Fractional reserve banking cannot be sustained under those conditions. So consequently, the money supply always expands under such a system. It expands at a rate faster than the expansion of goods and services, which means that the phenomenon called inflation is what we witness. And of course, inflation is not really the best word, I don't think. We're not seeing prices going up. what we're seeing is that the value of the dollar is going down. That's the real thing to keep your eye on. And if we had a money system backed by gold or silver or anything tangible, anything that couldn't be just created out of thin air, then the supply of money would remain absolutely constant to the supply of goods and services because it would be on par. It takes human effort to produce gold and silver. It takes human effort to produce a pair of shoes and an automobile. Human effort bidding against human effort, it balances. But if it's human effort to produce shoes and cars and political effort and decree to produce money out of nothing, you have a pretty good idea of which one is going to expand faster. But where you have a money supply based on something of tangible value, and historically gold and silver has always been the best choice, then the purchasing power of the monetary unit remains stable throughout incredibly long periods of time. If we had lived in ancient Rome and had a 1-ounce gold coin, we would have been able to buy a nice toga, a handcrafted belt, and a pair of sandals. Today, thousands of years later, 1-ounce gold coin, you're going to buy a really nice suit, handcrafted belt, and a pair of shoes. Even with the price of gold going up. Right now it's a little bit out of whack, but it'll come back down when the price of shoes and handcrafted belt and suit goes up, which is going to happen very soon. Anyway, today, if you had a 1-ounce gold coin, you'd have the same purchasing power, approximately, that you would have had 2,000 years ago. And there's nothing magic about it. It's just because we got politics out of it and we got dishonesty out of it. So the bottom line is that this process we're talking about is being paid for by you. Inflation is a tax. It's a hidden tax. You don't see it. Most people don't think about it. They just feel it. The price of gasoline is going up. The price of a loaf of bread is going up. And do they point the finger at the Federal Reserve or their elected representatives? No. They don't understand the money mechanism. They point the finger at the grocer or the farmer or the labor union that's forcing up wages. They point the finger at each other, not realizing who really the culprit is. So what did we get? To wrap up this first part, I took longer on it than I really had intended to, but we got a corporation chartered by Congress, given the exclusive franchise to create the nation's money supply. Think about that. Private banking system creates the nation's money. This is not government money. Look at it. It says Federal Reserve note. Now you understand that the Federal Reserve is a private banking cartel. Private corporation is creating the nation's money. We got a cartel that's a partner with the federal government to enforce the cartel agreement and to create the illusion of a government agency. We got a mechanism whereby Congress can raise unlimited taxes, hidden taxes, through this process of inflation without the public even knowing that they're being taxed by the government. Cool. And we got a law that allows the banks to collect interest on nothing. And finally, we got a golden parachute within the banking industry, which enables these people, these fraudulent banks, and it is fraudulent, to pass on the inevitable losses of their corrupt system to the taxpayers in the name of rescuing the economy. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have seen in Congress lately are not rescue packages, they're not economic stimulus packages. What we're witnessing is the legalized plunder of the American taxpayer. Now that brings me finally to the second part. And just to refresh your memory, I'm going to repeat it. Today, Americans are making another wish to the government genie, this time to create unlimited quantities of money to protect them from hardship. But what they are getting is unlimited quantities of money being used to deprive them of their freedom. In my book, this is the most important part of what I have to say to you today. Money is important, of course. It determines our standard of living, and to a large extent it determines our freedom too, because if you're a complete pauper, you don't have much flexibility. But if you have political freedom and economic freedom, even though you start off with nothing, you have the ability through sheer hard work and genius and maybe a little bit of luck and some help from your friends, you can make it, you can rebuild. That's how our nation started off, with nothing. We started off way behind the rest of the world, but we had freedom. Freedom to work and to compete, to make mistakes and to learn, try something different without being told, no, you can't do this and no, you can't do that, and you cannot do this as long as you've got meet this regulation and that regulation and pay this tax. If you've got freedom, you have everything. With one exception, I might add, and that, of course, is your health. That's why we at the Reality Zone focus on two important issues: health freedoms, health issues, and freedom issues. Because if you have health, but you're in a concentration camp, it doesn't do you much good. But if you have personal freedom, but you're sickly and on your deathbed, that doesn't do you much good. So we need to think, I believe, in both spheres. Now, the question comes as to why do Americans approve these bailouts and these so-called stimulus packages? One, many are ignorant of the economic reality. They're financially ignorant. They haven't learned some of the basic issues that we're talking about here. They think that money comes from the government, that it's all free. They really do. I can't think of this fellow's name, but he's one of these guys that walks through the audience a lot with a microphone, you know. It's a very popular show. And the issue was, some kind of a public welfare benefit. It might have even been health issues, I don't know. But the issue was basically, somebody stood up and said, why doesn't the government just pay for it? Why don't they just pay for our medical bills? Why don't they just pay for our food or whatever it is that we're complaining about? The government has the money. Why doesn't the government just issue the money and pay for it? And you know, that whole audience cheered. Every one of them cheered. I mean, they're dumber than dirt. They really think that that's free money. We published a cartoon yesterday, our recent issue of Unfiltered News, which I hope you all signed up for. I saw this wonderful cartoon. There's a husband and his wife are standing there in the street corner, and there's a picture of Obama dancing and throwing away money, you know, $100 bills everywhere, and he's just throwing it away. And the husband is saying, look, dear, he's doing exactly what he said he would. He's giving us all of this money for things. And she's looking at him like he's kind of stupid. She's saying, yes, he's got your wallet. This is it, you see. So we need a lot of basic education, and people don't have it, and so they approve of these things. They really think it's some kind of a humanitarian gesture that's going on. Others, of course, are desperate, and when people are in economic desperation, sometimes their logic takes the second place. They may say, I don't care, I need help. I can sympathize with that, but they're only going to make the system worse, and their desperation will increase. And of course, no one in the media talks about any alternative. That's the main thing. When's the last time on one of the major channels of communication you heard somebody talk about anything other than how much bailout and who's going to get it? Those are the two signs of the debate. Where's the guy that stands up and says, wait a minute, what we need is a good recession. What we need is to let these corrupt banks fail like any other company that makes bad decisions. It's not allowed as public debate within the media. And there's another reason that people are allowing it to happen. And I might add that all of this talk about executive salaries and bonuses, I believe, are a terrible distraction. Yes, it allows people, congressmen in particular, to say, I think that's terrible. Look at this bank that we bailed out with $1 trillion, and now they're paying $1 million in bonuses to their executives, and everybody's saying, yeah, that's terrible, isn't it? Ladies and gentlemen, That's a drop of sand on the beach compared to the real scam that's going on, which is the infusion of huge amounts of money, much larger than that, going to the institutions and coming to these same executives through perks and regular salaries. Why are we focused on bonuses? It's because it's a distraction. And because it allows the congressman to stand up and say, yeah, I'm all against these bonuses. Well, where is he on the issue of the stimulus package and the bailout? He's not against that. So he'd rather talk about the bonuses. That's my point. Yes, I'm against the bonuses too, but I wish these people in Congress and the Senate would talk about the real issues and not the distractions. A lot of people want to know whether we're headed for inflation or deflation. I'll give you my take on that. We must remember that inflation or deflation is a function of the amount of goods and services within the economy compared to the amount of money within the economy. And if they're both constant or growing at the same rate or shrinking at the same rate, either way, inflation or deflation will not happen. It's just stability of prices. When the supply of money increases faster than the supply of goods and services, or if the supply of money remains constant and goods and services start to drop, any of those conditions where it causes an imbalance, then you'll find either inflation or deflation depending on where the balance is moving. I mean, you all know that, but I wanted to reestablish it because I'm going to give you an analogy of a bucket. Let's imagine that the economy is a bucket of water. And here we see the Federal Reserve and their very obedient members of Congress voting to approve the process, pouring huge amounts of water into the top of the bucket. Now that's the money. That's the money supply in this analogy. And for some reason, the bucket isn't overflowing. Why is that? They're pouring the money in, trillions and trillions of dollars, and yet the price of things in society is still maintaining, sometimes going up, sometimes going down, but about the same amount of water. Why is that? It's because if you stand back and look at the bucket, you see a lot of water is falling out of the bottom of the bucket. There are a lot of holes in that bucket. What are the holes? This is where the money is disappearing. It's where losses are occurring. People have lost their savings. They've lost values in their homes. They've been foreclosed on their homes. They thought they had $250,000 equity in their home, or the value at least. They consider it as value. And now they're foreclosed, and the bank is selling it for $25,000 to some wholesaler. The difference between the original paper value and the real sale value is falling out of the bottom of the bucket. People no longer have savings. They've gone through their savings. Savings accounts are notoriously low now. People have lost their job. And there are a lot of losses, in other words, I'm trying to say, going out of the bottom of the economy, out of the bucket. And so the total quantity of the money remains relatively stable. We won't get into the euro dollar thing. That complicates it, and we don't need to complicate it because the principle will remain the same anyway. But so that's the reason the prices are not going up as much as we might otherwise expect. But there's something else to keep your eye on in this bucket analogy. Look at the bottom. Who are the people down there losing value, losing their money? It's the middle class. The people who've lost their savings, lost their house, losing their cars, lost their job. They don't have this income stream anymore. They're the ones that are paying for all of this process. And who are the ones at the top getting the new money? Not the same ones at the bottom losing the old money. The ones at the top are the politically favored classes, the ones with connections in Washington, the cartels, the big corporations, the ones that make the big donations to the congressman. These are the predators, the corporate and government predators in society. They're gaining all of this new money. The middle class is losing all the old money. So what we have now is that even though the quantity for the moment is remaining fairly constant, there is a shift of wealth from the bottom to the top. And we're seeing a redistribution of wealth. The middle class is being squeezed out of existence, squeezed into a smaller number. Meanwhile, the politically favored class is getting richer and richer and more powerful. It's a very important sociological movement to keep your eye on. It's not just a question of money, but it's a question of who has it. I believe that in the long run, we're going to see massive inflation because this is the only trick that these guys know. The ones that are running the Congress and running the Federal Reserve today have only one trick that they know, and that's to create more money out of nothing. They're committed to it. Their success depends upon it. And as long as we have the same people in office, this is what's going to continue. And they'll just keep creating more and more and more of it until finally the dollar has zero value. And at that point, it's a new game and a new shuffle. And in fact, it leads me to my conclusion, which is at that point, we no longer have any semblance of a free market, any semblance of a free society. We have a totalitarian society. What the government finances, the government controls. It's as simple as that. If the government is financing the auto industry, it controls the auto industry. If the government finances the insurance industry, it owns it, it controls it. If the government finances your health care, your retirement benefits, your unemployment benefits, if subsidizes your housing, ladies and gentlemen, the government owns you. This is the end game. This is where we're headed. If we do not turn this trend around, we will have lost our country. You will have lost your freedom, and our children will despise us. Is anyone motivated to do something about it? I hope so. We still can, but it's going to be a rough fight. I think we can. There are many organizations out here doing a good job. I've created one of my own. You've already heard about it. I invite you to take a look at Freedom Force International. You'll find it on the internet, freedomforceinternational.org. We are people who are determined to do something about it, not just read another book about it, not just hold another seminar or a dinner meeting, but to actually do something about it. The little unofficial motto of Freedom Force is, don't fight City Hall, become City Hall. You get it? Why don't we become active? Why don't we become active in politics and in other organizations? Why don't we become the ones who determine such policy instead of just the ones who pay the taxes and complain about it? It's a new thought for a lot of people. It means you've got to get up off of your chairs, you've got to get away from your television sets, you've got to go out into other organizations where the people are, you've got to spread the word, and you've got to become leaders. And so I urge you, if you're interested in that aspect of taking control, taking back control of our nation, come and visit us at freedomforceinternational.org. And so by closing, I would like to invite you to join with me to put this creature from Jekyll Island back into the bottle, put that cork in it, and toss it into the deepest sea we can find, and then work together to rebuild a free and prosperous America. Thank you.